Okay, so the peer space is a celebration and exploration of the human narrative, the roller coaster of life. And it's the fourth year that I've been doing this. It's evolved from a dinner group I started in Sofia, where I met a bunch of the guys here. And in the lockdown, it evolved into the virtual spaces. We pretty much run something every week since then, different experimental types of spaces, which are designed to be safe, a sort of safe space, supportive and encouraging. And our flagship session has become these talk nights, basically, which are like a deep dive into one person or one team, in this case, into their kind of world, whether that's their passion, their story, or maybe their vision for the world in some way. And that could happen once in a lifetime or every so often, let's say. And it's interactive, as I think is probably clear now, with the talk at the beginning, and the second sort of half of the next 40 minutes or so is like a Q&A and discussion, and even with the potential to lead into sort of collaborations and so on. And it's all over in 60 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Hannah and Will of Wind&Bones, who are lovely people, I'm going to say, who I met in Bulgaria. And when I met them, I just want to say that I've got this internationalized experience, but it's very European. I've actually worked in different parts of Europe, but primarily between UK and Bulgaria. And one of the cool things about them is it feels like they've been all over the place and all into Asia and everything. And so I think they're very cool people, and they're doing some pretty cool stuff with their lives. So I will hand over to them to take the floor, and pretty much the stage is theirs from here on. Go, guys.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Niall. That's really sweet. So, yeah, we're delighted to be here, aren't we? So, thank you. Okay, so our company, Wind&Bones, works at the intersection of writing, creativity, and social change. In other words, we run projects that change individual lives, that change the lives of collectives, and that incrementally, even in a small way, change the world. And the tool that we use for this is writing. So in this short talk, we're going to start by talking about the name of our company, Wind&Bones. The story of how we got our name goes back to medieval China. But as you will see, the name also captures the spirit of what we're doing at Wind&Bones. And it sums up our philosophy of writing, creativity, and social change. Then we're going to talk about one of our recent projects, so you can see how we work as well. And we're going to talk about the idea of writing as communication, because this underpins all of our work. Human beings are made for connection and for communication. And the ways in which we communicate really matter, because our communication helps build a shared world, a culture, and a vision of who we are and who we want to be. This is why for us, writing is such a powerful tool for social change. So let's start by going back into history and about our name.
Okay. So about 15 years ago, I was wandering around secondhand bookstores up in the northeast of England in Newcastle, and I stumbled across a book. And it was a set of essays about a Chinese text with the amazing name, The Literary Mind and the Carving of Dragons, or the Wenxin Yaolong. And because I was interested in writing and I was intrigued by this idea of carving dragons, what's that got to do with literature? Sounds kind of cool. So I picked up the book on a whim and I bought it. And I took the essay collection home and I read through and discovered that this old Chinese text was written sometime around the year 500 by a philosopher, a failed government official. Anybody worth their salt in Chinese history, poets, philosophers, they're almost all failed officials. They failed their exams, and then they went off and wrote poetry. So he was a philosopher, a failed government official, and a sometime Buddhist monk called Liu Xie. So I found out about him, but what really moved me about the book was the extracts on writing seemed be saying something, throwing light on questions I've been grappling with myself as a writer. Really deep, well-observed questions about creativity, about how to use words to bring about change. A couple of years ago, after that, I was in conversation about the Wind&Bones with an American poet friend, Dave Fonter. And he said, oh, I've got a translation of the text hanging around. I don't need it. I'll post it to you when I'm back in the States. So a few weeks later, this book turned up, this beautiful old hardback. And ever since, it's kind of been a regular companion with me. I've taken it everywhere. And I see it as a guide to writing, but also as more broadly a guide to life. And I think one of the reasons the Wind&Bones, or the Carving of Dragons literary mind, is so powerful is that it sees creativity incredibly holistically. And if we want to be creative, for Liu Xie, we have to pay attention not just to the project we're working on, but also to broader questions about how we're living, about how we relate to others, about how we spend our time, about how we deploy our energy, and about lots of other things as well. So you could say that the book is a book about living creatively.
So back in 2018, we were talking about a name for our new enterprise. And we ended up talking about a chapter of The Literary Mind and the Carving of Dragons. And the chapter was called Wind&Bones. And it's a very short chapter, but also a really powerful one. And in this chapter, Liu Xie says that to write well, you have to have a balance between wind, in other words, life or energy, and bones, in other words, organization and structure. So you need vigor and rigor, or as he writes, so cultivate the strength of the wind and make the bone robust. And this chimed really well with our experience as writers. Sometimes when you're writing, there is a lot of bone, you have structure and organization, and you know how everything fits together, but somehow the writing just doesn't come to life. It doesn't have any wind. And writing without wind, without energy or life, just doesn't have the power to affect other people. And of course, also the reverse is true. So for both of us, sometimes when we're writing, our writing has loads of energy and life, it zings with it, but that energy lacks focus and direction, or it could be pulling in many different directions. It has lots of wind, but not enough bone, I think. And a big part of the art of writing is balancing the wind and the bone, energy and organization. And this is not as easy as it looks. But when you get it right, then your writing can really communicate, it can really hit home. Or as it says in The Literary Mind and the Carving of Dragons, your writing will really gleam, which we really like.
So we started talking about this idea of Wind&Bones, fungal, and the more we reflected on our own lives and our own writing, the more we realized this is good advice not just for writing a poem, writing a book, but also for how to go about actually making change in the world. And it was good advice for life in general. And if you want to contribute positively to social change, and this is why we set up our social enterprise, you need to be organized. You need to be able to not just see structures clearly, but also to see how you can change and transform those structures. And this takes a lot of patient analytical skill. Social groups are incredibly complicated. Even the dynamics of the smallest group could take a lifetime to figure out. So when you're talking about how to bring about positive change, you need to be really sensitive to the dynamics and the structures in place. But also, I think you need to have that sense of life and energy and spirit. So you need to be able to nurture and channel your own creative imagination and also the creative imagination of others. And above else, you need to work in a way that doesn't exhaust you, that feeds you so you can go on working and making the world better than it was before. And we know people in many sort of walks of life, like academia, but also in the voluntary sector, working in the charity sector, for whom they're doing really good stuff, but in a way that is ultimately exhausting and ultimately self-defeating. So those two things, Wind and Bones, are what we kind of want to keep at the forefront of our minds. It's really easy, I think, to become despondent when you want to actually bring about change. And the issues that face us are endless, always. And while working to make those innumerable small changes that might contribute to improving our shared world, really it's important to keep hold of that wind, to kindle, to cultivate, and to nurture not only your own creative spirit, but the creative spirit of those you're working with. That's kind of why we love that idea, Wind and Bones.
Yes, so this is why we called ourselves Wind and Bones. It was partly a mission statement. It was partly a way of anchoring ourselves in the long tradition of thinking about creativity. And it was partly a reminder to ourselves about how we can best work towards the things that matter to us. If you combine both wind and bone, if you get it right, then according to Luce, you can go on acting and working creatively and bring new possibilities into being. And you can do this without the kind of stress and strain that we often imagine goes along with the creative or activist life. And so in our work, we aim to kindle the fires of human connection and communication. We believe really strongly that human beings have a powerful desire to connect, even if sometimes it's difficult to do so. And we believe that the art of connecting and bringing about change is to, help to set up channels for positive, heartfelt communication. And here, of course, there is both wind and bone. There's the energy and life that goes with this desire to connect. And there's the ways in which we can together work to positively channel this energy as well. And when you get the balance of wind and bone right, then you can transform this desire to connect into new ways of thinking, of acting, and of doing as well.
So what we're going to do now is just talk about one of our projects and how we work practically. So in the last few weeks, actually, we run a project in collaboration with the Goethe Institute in Sofia, the German Cultural Institute. And we also worked with the international NGO Caritas, who work with refugee communities. And the Goethe Institute approached us to do a day-long workshop for refugee writers that was going to be set in the Goethe's beautiful new library space in Sofia. So we proposed a multilingual creative writing workshop, and we spent the day with a group of refugee and asylum seeker writers who were writing in English, Arabic, not Farsi this time, Kurdish, Somali, Bulgarian. So at least 5 languages at play in the workshop. And we've done a lot of projects like this. And coming from creative writing backgrounds, this often puzzles people. How can you run a writing workshop in multiple languages, particularly if you don't speak them all? Our Kurdish and our Somali are pretty non-existent. But a lot can be communicated across linguistic divides, and both that sort of spirit, that wind, and also the bone, the sense of the structure of people's experiences and ideas. And one of the things that was incredibly deeply moving about this particular workshop was hearing writing in its original language with its own rhythm, its own sound quality, but even more than that, its deep connection to the spoken voice and the life of the writer. We did, however, also have a very good translator on hand who worked between Arabic and English mainly and helped put the storytelling in context. And throughout this workshop, as people were trading stories with each other, and these are people from Palestine, from Iraq, from Somalia, from all kinds of places, we sort of found that through this trading of stories, we're not just building connection, but also building something a bit more intimate, building friendship. So the writers are sharing stories about their flight from war and conflict, or stories about small, intimate things. One woman wrote a beautiful piece about washing the windows and her relationship with her brother. And all of those stories really matter. And particularly, and one of the reasons we care passionately about this kind of project is working with refugee communities. We can push back against the powerful narratives in the media that attempt to dehumanize refugees and asylum seekers and those fleeing their home country, often at great risk in search of safety. So it's a process of rehumanizing, or particularly if we can get those stories out into the world.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So this is only one of our current projects, and we work in lots of other ways too. We're running a project with an NGO called Improve at the moment, who work in 8 European countries to support survivors of domestic abuse. And again, our aim is to get participants in our workshops to write powerful stories that have both wind and bone, and that can bring about social change. And the aim of this project is to get people talking about an issue that is still quite hidden, particularly here in Bulgaria, which is where we're piloting the project. We're also devising a series of courses for the Parami Institute, who are a higher education institute in Myanmar, and that will help to address the black hole in education that's been left behind in the wake of the recent military coup, if obviously you've been keeping up with the news. And currently in Myanmar, the civil disobedience movement has led to traditional higher education programs just grinding to a halt. So with the Parami Institute, we're running courses in writing for social change, in ethical leadership, and also philosophy too, which is funded by an American university, but will be free for the participants. And that will help to provide free, high quality education that can help to build an alternative future for Myanmar. And then we also work with individuals as well through our mentoring program. And we've worked with writers of all kinds, all across the world. We've had mentees who are professors of Chinese history from the US.
The brilliant Carla Nappi, go and buy her books. She's fantastic.
Yeah, totally. We've worked with memoirists, fantasy writers, Buddhists. So we're quite broad with our collection of mentees. And with all of our mentees, where there's energy, where the energy is where the life is. And then we aim to cultivate more bone and to build kind of a more robust structure for bringing these ideas to light using the written word. And we see the work with individuals as part of our broader commitment to social change as well. Individual stories told with conviction and power are one way that the world can absolutely be changed. And as one example of our mentoring work, recently we worked with a scholar of ancient Egypt, Dr. Angela Stein, to develop a book proposal for a book that was rethinking the ethics of our relationships with human remains in museums. And we're delighted that her book has been accepted by Manchester University Press. And will be published next year. Yeah.
So that's a roundup of what we do on some of our projects. We're obviously delighted to take any questions you have about writing, social change, wind and bones, particularly those kind of philosophical issues about creativity. And also, if you have any writing projects brewing, or you're involved with any organisations that's interested in working with us, we'd obviously love to talk more. So thanks so much also to Niall for inviting us. And now over to you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Silent Zoom clapping is always a bit weird, isn't it? It's very nice. It's always a bit weird.
Yeah, muted clapping. Yeah.
Mine wasn't muted. I'm just a clapper. I'm a compulsive clapper.
Good.
Nice, I like it.
We heard you over there in Toronto.
It's maybe worse when everyone's muted except one person. It sounds like one person clapping. But so basically, we've got about good 20 minutes. So opens up to the floor now. I wasn't sure what I wanted to ask. I've written down loads of things I'd like to ask, but I would happily go last. So who would like to ask a question of Hannah and Will? Rosalind, go.
Well, first of all, I'm just dead impressed by what you do. I think it's so important because when you're inundated, especially on LinkedIn, by people praising Bezos still and praising Margaret Thatcher, please tell me, why do people, you never heard of Angela Merkel, people? Like, anyway, there's a cult of these two people. So when I see you, it actually gives me hope because I have a writing practice. I call it brave writing. And I mostly work with people, seniors, who have difficulty expressing emotions and thoughts, and in some cases around childhood trauma and genocide. So I'm very interested in your work. And I want to ask you, well, when was this moment? Like, was there a pivotal moment? Because I've got those moments. Was there a pivotal moment when you realized that this was a calling?
Oh, good question.
Do you want to start?
Yeah. I don't think there was a kind of sort of a specific moment for me that I can pin down, but I think I've always, so before I got into creative writing and started doing my PhD, I was working in the voluntary sector for quite a number of years. So I was working to help distribute grant funding to small community-based organisations where I used to live in Leicester and Leicestershire. So I did that for a number of years and just got to know kind of so many voluntary groups, small community groups who are doing amazing and, you know, actually life-saving work on a voluntary basis that I think really just definitely made me feel that in some ways I should absolutely be doing more or doing, you know, as much as I could. And I was also a trustee as well for an LGBT sexual, like, mental health charity as well. So I've kind of always had an interest in the kind of voluntary sector and kind of working with communities for positive social change. But I think it was probably kind of quite a long process, I guess, into it.
And I think probably the same for me. There was no single light bulb moment. So I started out as a writer, doing a lot of community-based work and working in hospitals. One of my favourite things was working in one of Birmingham's biggest hospitals in the UK as a writer in residence for a few years. Working in schools with small community groups and that kind of thing. Mental health services. I did then go into university teaching, but I became frustrated, I think, by the idea of literature. And, you know, I love literature and literature's great, but there's something about the fetishization of literature that goes on those kind of circles where you forget that actually this is human communication. And I thought back to some of the other projects I was doing and how to kind of use writing as a way of just developing more positive human communication, human connection. And that seemed like the very best thing I could do with the skills I had.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the first workshops that we delivered together was with refugees. And that was in Leicester, so my hometown, and where Will had been living for about 10 years. And it was, again, real diverse mix of people. And we got invited, you know, to kind of by a friend, wasn't it, Alex, to come and deliver a workshop. And neither of us had done anything like that before, but we were just so moved by working with these individuals, and just to set, I think also we were kind of expecting it to be this really kind of serious thing where people will be telling off, you know, horrendous stories, and of course, like there were some of those stories, but actually the kind of sense of joy and kind of and chaos that came about in the workshops, like, and of people connecting and communicating was just like was so energizing and was just so much fun, and just kind of made us, well, we just loved it, didn't we? So kind of from there we were like, yeah, this is the kind of thing that we need to be doing.
We were running the workshop in a hall where they were also serving lunch and having a fitness football class in the same hall. So there was probably a little bit more wind than there was bone going on there. But it was fantastic, and that sense of life was wonderful.
It's funny you say that, because it feels like heroic what you're doing, because it feels like a tough nut, like to kind of get people into it, like because of things like when you compare watching a football match with writing, and when you think of it at a base level, it's like it's a challenge, right, to get the interest. But I believe in the power of it, but it is like, it sort of seems heroic what you guys do.
But
you know?
it doesn't feel heroic. I mean, because people love communicating, they love connecting. We're kind of, you know, little social primates who just spend our entire life, you know, prodding and poking each other, and you know, finding out how each other works, and making friends and falling out, and all of that. So
maybe not heroic, but it's necessary. Like, no offense, we don't need any more hamburgers. There's enough hamburgers for the next 100 years. We don't need any more franchisees. We need actually maybe a franchisee from you guys. So the more people can start looking inward without disgust and shame, the more people can move forward and be, you know, the buzzword, resilient, you know. So, and it's important labor. Like, this is important labor that we all really need.
Totally. Has someone else got a question? Just because the time does go quite fast. So if others have got questions they want to ask, comments or questions, anyone? Like, if everyone has a question, just get a chance. Go, Sally.
Sally.
I'm really interested in thoughts on the physical act of writing. So, do you find that writing with a pen on a piece of paper, getting a nice book, and physically writing helps creativity, or you go straight to the laptop and type in there?
Let's go first.
Okay. In a lot of the workshops we do, and we don't start with writing at all. So for various reasons, people can seize up quite easily when you ask them to write. And that might be because they've left school at 15 and had bad experiences, and it's a terrifying thing. Or it might be because they're academics with 15 PhDs and they immediately go into kind of academic mode, and lose that sense of human connection. So a lot of our work actually is initially face-to-face communication, and we've been sort of developing ways of working with different kinds of groups where we get people talking or coming up with ideas, and then get them to leave all pens, all papers, all laptops to one side, and to sit face to face and connect and tell stories.
Which is, and that in itself is initially kind of a little bit intimidating as well, because we kind of sort of in a workshop initially, people have got their notebooks or their laptops, or and they'll kind of clutch them nervously, and we say no, you've made notes. Now it's all about face-to-face communication, so there's no barriers. And like Will and I don't, you've probably noticed, we like to use our hands quite a lot as kind of to communicate our stories, and that kind of really helps to build energy, and actually just gets people to think about just the act of storytelling, actually, and so they don't seize up, they don't panic about their word selection and and how to spell things on the page, because actually they just see it as a story that they're telling to to a friend in a workshop, like you would if you were sat in a bar or a pub or a coffee shop, you know, telling people a story. And so then it becomes kind of much more fun, much more full of energy and less scary. And then by the time you actually get to the, you know, the time where we are getting to people writing, they're just, you know, crazily typing away or writing.
That's really nice. Yeah. So you act it out kind of first, and then writing comes easier sort of after that.
Yeah. And then the sort of technologies you use to put things on paper, in a way, it doesn't really matter. I mean, carving things on blocks of stone takes too long, but pens, paper, laptops, phones, you know, it's kind of all fine. And we let people work any way they like, and people have their own preferences. But when they're going into the writing from that human communication, we get them to keep bearing in mind that sense of the other person they were communicating with and the energy and life of what they were communicating, the points where the person listening to them was vaguing out, the points where they were really interested. So we're less hung up on technology. We both use laptops a lot, but
yeah, occasionally we'll do kind of by hand, but
yeah,
but not very often. Yeah, mainly laptops for us.
I love a manual typewriter, but the neighbours don't. So.
Okay, guys, questions? More questions? Another question? Someone that's not? Yeah, Bob.
Do you find there's significant differences in people's abilities to tell stories based on their backgrounds, their ethnicity, etc.?
I think we're all good at telling stories. I think it's just making sure that people understand that that they can tell stories and they have got stories. I think often people aren't kind of sure sort of initially, because it's like, well, I'm really boring. I don't really have much that's interesting to say, or, you know, why would anybody be interested in this? But actually, just kind of, you know, telling people that their stories are really interesting, I think is a really good kind of start point. Sure, you've got stuff to add there.
Yeah, I think there are also different traditions of storytelling. So some of the expectations that are taught in, say, literary creative writing courses in the English-speaking world in particular, they're not the same expectations that you would have if you were a writer in French. And we had a writer who we worked with who submitted something in English, and we were like, oh dear. And then he gave us the French things it was a direct translation of, and the English seemed too flowery, and the French seemed perfect and beautiful. And there is a kind of tradition of writing in English of literature where you strip everything back, the, you know, Carver-esque kind of Hemingway stripping things down. And then you have traditions that are given to more kind of Baroque excess, and the idea of what a story is differs in different places. Yeah. So I think all of that, we've kind of developed more of a sort of sensitivity to the variety of cultural forms of storytelling as well. And that's still an ongoing learning process.
Yeah. I kind of feel like we don't kind of go around sort of teaching creative writing and kind of instilling the kind of the British tradition of writing and kind of how it should be, because, you know, in Bulgaria it's very different, you know, France, as Will just said, you know, in Myanmar, you know, there are different writing traditions. So we kind of, it's nice to make room for all of them.
Great. Who else has a question or a comment or what's come up for anyone? MCK.
So I'm curious, in the last 3 years of formalizing Wind&Bones and bringing structure, I guess, to the impact that you want to create and you want to make, how have either of you changed and evolved kind of like through this process of doing this winding and boning work?
Ooh, interesting.
Do you want to start? I can start, right?
Yeah,
okay. I mean, I think in terms of my sense of the possibilities of words and what they can do and how you can you can work with writing as a tool has massively expanded, and it's changed my relationship with my own writing quite a lot, I think. It's been massively freeing coming from a sort of academic, well, sort of Western philosophy, but also a creative writing background, to start picking apart some of those assumptions and thinking about doing things differently. I think also one of the things that has been the most immense pleasure has been a lot of my teaching in the past has been solo teaching, and we do so much together. And there's a kind of, we see it as alternating pilot and co-pilot, and it's a really fascinating process in terms of teaching. I kind of think every classroom should have two people who alternate, because one person can sit back and observe and tweak the dials, and the other person can be steering, and then you can swap.
That's true, actually. Yeah, I really enjoy the kind of co-teaching, and we both, mainly we co-teach, but we also do separate teaching as well, which is individual. And I think, you just get you kind of know that your sessions are really tight when there's two of you, because you kind of, like you have kind of bursts of concentration, don't you? And sometimes, you might kind of lose concentration, but when there's kind of two of you, and then you can do these kind of little tweaks as well, because one might be in a different position in the room, and it's like, maybe with this group here or this individual here, it's not kind of quite working. So let's kind of mix it up a certain way and, change this, and to kind of be able to do that kind of in flight to continue with the pilot co-pilot thing is actually has been massively just really interesting, actually, and really good. And I think probably another thing as well for me is being able to connect with people doing this thing, because it's not an ordinary 9-to-5 job, not just going to an office where I'm kind of working with the same people, and being able to connect with people from different cultures, different backgrounds in different countries, has just been really interesting, and has kind of massively sort of opened my kind of horizons in lots of ways. So it's been really good.
There's a bit. So there's a bit in Calvino's Invisible Cities where he talks about trading stories, and how somebody tells you stories you meet in the city, and you talk about somebody tells you stories about wolves, and you tell your own stories about wolves, and then when you leave, the wolves or the brothers or the rivers or whatever the things in your own stories that you tell, they become enriched and slightly different. And through, I think, sharing so many stories with people, it does sort of broaden your own pool of stories, and it enriches them and it deepens them. And it's a kind of odd, incalculable value but that's been one of the big transformational things, I think.
So guys, I want to ask, I had 4 questions, but I'm going to roll them into 2, and it's a bit zoomed out. The first, and it's sort of like perhaps a bit more around the vision of what you might see for the world. But the first part is really about how can we get more people, what's the first step people can take into writing, especially perhaps for social change? And generally, how can we get more people writing, let's say? That's the first part. And the second part, I realize it's all connected, is I feel there's a sense in which, as a communication style, writing goes deeper. And so there is a sense that it's good for healing, and maybe it's a good thing for these times, like that we've all been through this thing that we've been through this last year or two. So my question is about those 2 things, about the idea of how we get more people writing and how to take a first step into getting people to write more, but also its role potentially as a sort of force for healing people. For like, I just wanted to get a sort of zoomed out perspective on those 2 things, if that's not insane.
I mean, I think in terms of kind of getting more people writing, I mean, because we've run workshops where it's been specifically people that have come along because they're interested in writing, but then others, they've never written before, and they've just kind of had a vague sort of interest in writing. And I think not being kind of really formal and kind of classroomish about things, and actually, as we were saying, it's all about communication, and sort of seeing it as communication first and foremost just strips away so much concern or worry that people have. And, you know, just to say it doesn't matter, you know, when you start to put stuff down on paper or, you know, screen, don't worry about spelling or, you know, writing any language, you know, whatever's comfortable. And actually it's just to kind of get people to, you know, to not be worried, and to just kind of to have the energy for it, really. So yeah, so kind of non-formal sort of classroom setting for me, I think massively helps in communication.
To do it when you're in the mood, maybe. Is it a bit about that? When the mood takes you?
I think sometimes, but then I mean it depends kind of what you're writing for, because obviously if you have a deadline, or, you know, like I've just finished a short story collection and that I'm writing, but I now want to write a novel and I've got an idea. I know that some days that I'll kind of have some time allocated for that. I won't necessarily want to do it, but I'm just going to have to sit down and do it because it's just work.
Although even then, and there's loads of lovely stuff in the Wenqin Yaolong on this from Liu Xie, this medieval Chinese writer. He is absolutely 100% committed to pleasure. And the idea that writing should be suffering, and the idea of the suffering artist, he has no patience with.
Nor do I.
He thinks that in writing you should be seeking pleasure. If it's becoming miserable, you should go and engage in free and easy wandering. You should hang out with your friends. You should talk. You should laugh. You should joke. And then you should, when you feel the wind again, that's the energy, you should return and pick up the pen and write. And that's the balancing your sort of your energy, but also always looking for pleasure. And that doesn't often get much of a look in.
I like it. And no doubt it is good for us, right? It's a good thing for us to write. It's healthy.
Yeah,
and
I think so.
And actually, I think in terms of your question on healing, I think probably that sort of seeking pleasure through writing and seeking out the pleasure in writing and telling stories, even if they're difficult stories, that can be incredibly deeply healing in itself. We can think of pleasure as quite superficial, but I think it goes sort of all the way down. It's a deep thing.
Guys, I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
So I did want to wrap up because we are at the end of the hour, and I wanted to really thank Hannah and Will very much. I was doing a clap, silent clap, for coming along and being part of this. I've really enjoyed it. Time really, really flew. Just to say, is there a way for people to reach you? Is it best to go to your website, Wind&Bones? Yeah, is that the best way?
So windandbones.com.
Yeah.
And contact@windandbones.com, or just
let's write it in the chat.
We'll write it in the chat.
You can write it in the chat, and if you want the chat, just save the chat before you leave, because I don't share it with anyone, so just save it. Okay, thank you very, very much for that. And I just want to wrap up by saying that really appreciate you coming along and your time, and everyone for participating. And our next event is in 2 weeks. Follow the peer space for all these events. Our next event is in 2 weeks with Jane Tyson, whose event I'm about to run to now. It's all about resilience in kids, another very super fascinating subject, which is she has a whole initiative around that that she does regular events for. So thank you again, everyone. It's exactly on the hour. Catch up with you soon, Hannah and Will, to see what you thought about that.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you for everybody for coming.
Thank you so much.
It's brilliant. Total pleasure. Take care.